There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another We in Other Words. This is an occasional series about word origins and etymology. I'm not going to give a long song and dance type of introduction this time. Let's get right to the words. I've got three for you, as always. The first one is from a novel that I started and I just couldn't get into it, had too many things going on. I put it aside. I'm going to come back to it. It's by a British writer who's not that well known, Elizabeth Berridge. Sing Me Who You Are. Wonderful title. And I enjoyed her final novel called, I don't remember the title of it, but this one, it just wasn't the right time. But from this book, on page 20, I got the word panache. Obviously, I know what panache meant, at least vaguely, but I wondered why it meant what it meant. The main character, Harriet, there's a rundown of all the eccentric people in her family. And then the last sentence is, at least Aunt Esther had died full of panache. So that's the sentence. Panache, I think as everybody knows, in the modern metaphorical meaning means flamboyant confidence of style or manner. And that's the meaning that's obviously being used here. But the historical meaning, the original meaning in English and in French, was a tuft or plume of feathers, especially as a headdress or on a helmet. And I've got some pictures of some Roman panache helmets, and they are fabulous. So you can kind of see how the headdress, the helmet plume led to the more psychological, personality-based meaning for panache. Those helmet plumes were especially common in the early modern period. Here are some pictures. Panache in French is the literal translation is to that plume, worn on a hat or a helmet. Apparently King Henry IV of France was famous for them, and his war cry was, in English, follow my white plume, or in French, ralliez-vous à mon panache blanc. Also was a big thing in Cyrano de Bergerac. There was an 1897 play by that name by Edmond Rostand. Apparently that was largely responsible in the way that panache was used in that play for transforming the literal meaning, the plume on the military helmet, into this more modern metaphorical meaning of flamboyant confidence. In the English translation, Cyrano says, yet there is something still that will always be mine, and when I go to God's presence, there I will doff it and sweep the heavenly pavement with a gesture. Something I'll take unstained out of this world. My panache. Canadian French, it refers to antlers. So panache came into English in the mid-16th century, and it meant originally, as I've said, a tuft or plume of feathers. And that goes back to the Italian pennaccio, late Latin pinnaculum, from which the English word pinnacle descends. So a pinnacle is a mountaintop, a sharp peak, and a promontory. So when you looked especially at those military headdresses for the Roman soldiers, you could see how the idea of a peak came to be associated with it. And that pinnacle goes back to pin. And pin, actually, one of the many meanings that the farther you go back into Latin, pin meant a feather, and then back to the Proto-Indo-European root, pet, which meant to rush or to fly. So you can see sharpness, feather, and I guess it would be the feather, the other end of it that would be sharp, but there's a whole bunch of associations between pin, peg, feather, plume, flying, rushing, that gets all the way down to panache. That same Proto-Indo-European root gives us other words like centripetal, compete, competent, hippopotamus, perpetual, pinion, propitiation, symptom, and many other words. The next word is twitcher, which comes from one of my favorite reads of 2023, The Stromness Dinner by Peter Benson. And this is a bird-watching term. It's not a formal term, it's kind of slang. And the protagonist, Ed Beach, who was my favorite character in anything I read in 2023, he's talking about wanting to learn more about wine and learn more about birds. The woman he's very interested in, she says, they're one of the reasons. So birds. Birds are one of the reasons Daddy moved up here. He wasn't a twitcher, but he loved watching them. Birds, she said. And then Ed says, what's a twitcher? She says, you know, those people who chase after rare birds, make lists of them. They're like train spotters. You get a lot of them up here. And this is set on the Isle of Orkney in Scotland. So that made me curious. Why do they call these really officious, anal bird watchers twitchers? They're into bird watching only so they can check off on their list. Oh, I've seen this rare bird. I've seen this rare bird. Twitching, the ing form, twitching is the pursuit of a previously located rare bird. So you're not trying to discover a new bird, but you're trying to see a rare bird. It's a mistake to use twitcher or twitching to talk about general, normal bird watchers, birders. It's only supposed to refer to this type, who will travel long distances to see a rare bird who would then be tipped or counted on a list. It came into English in the 1950s, used to describe the nervous behavior of Howard Medhurst, a British bird watcher. Apparently he had a real twitch. So let's go to twitch. Of course we know that twitching means moving, jerkily, quivering, spasmodic muscular contractions. His hand twitched. Going farther back, it meant to pull or pluck something, or to have a pang, a physical or mental pang, a twitch of remorse. The verb came into English in the late 12th century, and it meant to pull apart with a quick jerk. Went back to Old English, twiccian, which meant to pluck, gather, catch hold of, Proto-Germanic, Low German, Dutch, Old High German, and as far back as they've traced it to German zwicken, meaning to pinch or tweak. And the last word for tonight is demure. That's an adjective, and that I encountered, and again, I knew the word, or I thought I did. Actually, I didn't know the word. I'm about to get to that. This Indian novel, which I loved, Cobalt Blue, by Sachin Kundalkar, translated by Jerry Pinto. I've read this earlier last year, buddy read with Joe Smith. Here is the sentence with demure, the adjective. The protagonist is writing about one of his friends or somebody he knows. He was the kind who wore checked shirts tucked into trousers that had 2 demure pleats in the front. What I have to confess is that I didn't realize that the adjective demure had a very different meaning from the verb demur. I thought it was all one word. I hadn't got all that sorted out in my mind. So, somewhat sheepishly, I'm gonna do a deep dive on it right now. So the adjective demure means to be reserved, modest, and shy. Apparently, according to this dictionary, typically used of a woman, a demure young lady. Or of clothing, and this I guess is the meaning that's being used in this sentence that I read, giving a modest appearance. Apparently, pleats can be modest, so we'll leave that there. So demure came into English in the late 14th century, meaning calm or settled, sober, grave, serious. Came from Anglo-French, which came from Old French, a word, meur, meur, which meant mature, fully grown, ripe, hence discreet, which goes back to Latin. So the verb mature, which can also be an adjective, is all part of the same family. Mature, the verb, came into English in 1400, but it goes back to the same word family. And one of the first meanings of it was to encourage suppuration, which is like oozing pus. But apparently in some plants, I don't know anything about plants, when they are mature, when they ripen, they start to ooze stuff. So that's kind of gross. Let's move on. It goes back to Latin, mātūrare, and back to the Proto-Indo-European root metu, meaning ripeness. And I didn't find anything out about that Proto-Indo-European root, but nonetheless, that is the adjective demure, which is very closely related to mature. The verb demur, which I was hopelessly confused about in terms of the connection between the two, is not connected at all. The meaning of demur, you probably knew this, and I was all mixed up on the meanings, means to linger, to delay, to hesitate, to be reluctant to do something, to raise doubts or objections about something. A very different meaning. It entered English in 1200, came from an Old French verb demore, which meant to delay, going back to the Latin demorari, meaning to linger, loiter, or tarry, And that goes back to the prefix de, and then the root is morari, which means to delay, which comes from mora, which means a pause or a delay, from which we get the word moratorium. So moratorium and demur, the verb, not the adjective demur, are kissing cousins in the etymological department. The sense of raising objections, taking exception, or having scruples, that modern sense came into English in the early 17th century from legal stuff. Moratorium came into English in 1875. A moratorium originally meant an authorization to a debtor to postpone due payment. Getting back to demur, the verb, it goes back to a completely obsolete noun that came from French. I think it's even the same exact spelling. I don't know how it was pronounced in English. Demurrer. Here's the spelling, which came into English in the early 16th century, meaning a pause and a delay. They're completely unrelated, with just one letter difference between the adjective demure and the verb demur. And that is what I found out about that. Any comments? Thanks for watching.